What happens when a Hollywood legend walks onto The View expecting a routine conversation, only to realize within minutes that he isn't being interviewed, he's being challenged? And what happens when the man sitting across from Joy Behar refuses to absorb another accusation in silence? That is where this story takes a dramatic turn. Sylvester Stallone had spent decades being underestimated, rejected, criticized, and told that his best days were behind him. But on this particular morning, something was different. Joy Behar wasn't simply asking about his career. Her questions were becoming sharper, more personal, and increasingly difficult to dismiss. At first, Stallone stayed calm. He answered respectfully. He gave her every opportunity to move on. But Joy kept pushing. And then came one question that changed the entire atmosphere at the table. Because what began as a discussion about movies suddenly became a confrontation about age, success, ego, and whether Stallone still had a place in Hollywood. And before this interview was over, the person asking the questions would find herself answering them. The morning had started normally at the View Studios in Manhattan. Sylvester Stallone arrived expecting exactly what his team had prepared him for: a promotional interview, a few questions about his latest project, some discussion about his legendary career, and perhaps a little humor along the way. He carried himself with the familiar confidence of someone who had spent decades in front of cameras. There was no sign that he expected trouble. He greeted members of the production staff, exchanged polite words with the hosts, and settled into the routine that had become second nature after years in Hollywood. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary. But there was one detail Stallone couldn't have known yet. Joy Behar appeared unusually prepared. She had a folder of notes beside her and seemed more focused than usual as she reviewed the upcoming conversation. While the other hosts appeared relaxed, Joy's attention remained fixed on the questions in front of her. Stallone noticed none of this as anything unusual. He had no reason to. He believed he was walking into a conversation about movies. What he didn't know was that the first question would immediately change the tone of the entire interview. The cameras were barely settled when Joy Behar opened the conversation with a question that sounded harmless at first. "So, Sylvester, you're still doing action movies at your age. Do you ever think it's time to step aside and let some of the younger actors take over?" For a moment, Stallone simply looked at her. It wasn't an outrageous question on the surface. He had heard questions about his age before. After decades in Hollywood, criticism was hardly new to him. So he smiled slightly and answered without confrontation. "As long as people want to see the stories, and I'm physically capable of doing them, I don't see age as a reason to stop." The answer was calm, reasonable, almost impossible to argue with. But Joy wasn't finished. She immediately questioned whether audiences were really demanding his return or whether nostalgia was doing most of the work. Stallone's expression tightened, though his voice remained controlled. He explained that franchises like Rocky and Creed had connected with different generations and that he wasn't making movies simply to protect his ego. Joy listened. Then she leaned forward, because her next question wasn't about his movies anymore. It was about whether Stallone deserved to keep making them. Joy didn't let the conversation settle. Instead, she flipped through her notes and moved directly toward the subject that would make the atmosphere even more uncomfortable. "But your recent movies haven't exactly been dominating the box office," she said. "Isn't some of this really about ego? At what point does an actor recognize that audiences want something new?" Stallone took a breath before answering. "I think the audience decides that," he said. "If people stop showing up, that's information. But as long as there's an audience and a story worth telling, I don't see the problem." It was a measured response. Stallone was still giving her the benefit of the doubt. Joy, however, pushed further. She questioned whether Rocky and Rambo had become little more than nostalgia machines. Then she suggested that his continued involvement might prevent younger actors from getting the opportunities they deserved. That accusation changed something. Stallone's hands tightened together on the table. He explained that he had spent years creating opportunities for younger performers, writers, and filmmakers. But Joy dismissed the explanation almost immediately. And suddenly, the interview wasn't really about movies anymore. It was becoming a question of whether Stallone had earned the right to remain in the spotlight. Joy leaned forward and delivered the accusation more directly. "Hollywood has changed," she said. "There are younger actors trying to get their first real opportunity. Do you ever consider that by continuing to take these roles, you're taking a place that could belong to someone else?" The question landed differently. Stallone's expression hardened, but he still refused to lose his composure. I don't see it that way, he replied. I've spent my entire career opening doors. I've worked with people who were just getting started. I've given opportunities to writers, directors, and actors because I know what it's like to have someone tell you that you don't belong. Joy wasn't convinced. But you're still the face of these franchises, she said. You still get the attention. You still get the money. At some point, doesn't making room for others mean stepping aside yourself? For the first time, Stallone stopped answering immediately. He looked at Joy for several seconds before speaking. You're assuming that someone else succeeding requires me to disappear. The table went quiet. It was a simple sentence, but it exposed the deeper disagreement between them. Joy believed Stallone's continued presence represented an old system that needed to make room. Stallone believed his presence represented something else entirely. Proof that persistence could create a place where none existed before. And then Joy made the argument even more personal. But just when it seemed the conversation might finally move toward safer ground, Joy said something that immediately changed the temperature around the table. Maybe the problem is that some people simply don't know when it's time to let go. The words were delivered casually, but there was nothing casual about their impact. Stallone stared at her. Joy continued, suggesting that Hollywood had spent too many years rewarding the same familiar faces while younger performers waited for their opportunity. Then she questioned whether Stallone's continued success was really about the quality of his work or simply his refusal to leave the spotlight. That was the moment something shifted. Until then, Stallone had been defending individual movies. Now he was being asked to defend his entire career. He slowly leaned back in his chair. You're making it sound like I've stayed here because I refused to give someone else a chance, he said. Joy didn't retreat. I'm saying that sometimes success becomes difficult to give up. A tense silence followed. And for the first time, Stallone's calm expression disappeared completely. He had spent his entire life fighting the idea that he didn't belong. Now someone was sitting across from him, suggesting that his greatest achievement had become the problem. And the next question would push him even closer to the edge. Stallone leaned forward, his voice still controlled, but the patience behind it was beginning to disappear. Joy, you talk about my career like it was handed to me, he said. It wasn't. He explained that when he first wrote Rocky, almost nobody in Hollywood believed in him. He wasn't the obvious choice for a leading role. He wasn't the established star studios were looking for. He was a struggling actor trying to create one opportunity for himself. He reminded Joy that the studios wanted the script, but they wanted someone else to play Rocky. I could have taken the money and walked away, Stallone said. But then the character wouldn't have been mine anymore. For him, Rocky wasn't simply another franchise. It represented everything he had been told he couldn't become. He had faced rejection. He had struggled financially. He had been told that his appearance, his voice, and his background weren't right for Hollywood. Yet he kept going. That character came from everything I was fighting through, he explained. People saw themselves in Rocky because he wasn't supposed to win. Joy listened, but instead of acknowledging the point, she reminded him that all of that happened decades ago. Stallone's eyes narrowed. That's exactly what you don't understand, he replied. It may have happened decades ago, but I haven't forgotten what it took to get here. And suddenly, the argument became much bigger than a movie. Stallone's voice remained low, but the patience that had defined his answers was fading fast. Joy, I understand you have questions, he said. But you're not asking questions anymore. Joy immediately pushed back. Then what am I doing? You're making accusations, Stallone replied. The table went quiet. He began listing them one by one. She had questioned his age. She had questioned his motives. She had suggested that his success was based on ego and nostalgia. Now she was suggesting that his continued career was taking opportunities away from younger performers. And every time I answer you, Stallone continued, you move the argument somewhere else. Joy insisted she was simply challenging him. But Stallone shook his head. There's a difference between challenging somebody and deciding what their intentions are before they even answer. The other hosts remained unusually quiet. Joy tried to regain control, explaining that Hollywood had changed and that established stars needed to recognize when it was time to make room. Stallone leaned closer. Make room for who? He asked. And who gets to decide when I've stayed too long? Joy paused. That question hung over the table, because Stallone wasn't defending one film anymore. He was challenging the entire premise behind her questioning. Then Joy delivered the sentence that would push the confrontation into completely different territory. Joy appeared determined to have the final word. Maybe this is simply what happens when people get older, she said. You become more sensitive to criticism. Maybe that's another sign that it's time to step back. For a second, Stallone didn't respond. The silence was heavier than anything he had said before. He looked directly at Joy, his expression completely still. Did you just call me old and weak? Joy immediately tried to soften it. No, I'm saying you're not handling criticism the way you used to. But Stallone shook his head. That's not what you said. The atmosphere around the table changed instantly. Until that moment, Stallone had been explaining himself. Now he was demanding an explanation from Joy. You've questioned my work, he said. You've questioned my motives. You've questioned whether I deserve to keep working. And now you're telling me that because I'm older, I should somehow accept being spoken to this way. Joy attempted to interrupt, but Stallone raised his hand. No, you asked your questions. I've answered them. His voice grew stronger. You want to talk about criticism? Fine. I've lived with criticism my entire life. He paused, staring directly across the table. But don't confuse criticism with disrespect. That sentence silenced everyone, because Stallone had finally stopped defending the career. He was defending himself, and the next few moments would show just how far his patience had actually been pushed. Stallone suddenly leaned forward, his voice rising as the frustration he had been holding back finally broke through. Constructive criticism, he said. You think this has been constructive criticism? Joy tried to respond, but Stallone continued before she could finish. For the last several minutes, you've told me I'm too old, that I'm living on nostalgia, that I'm motivated by ego, and that I'm taking opportunities away from younger people. He placed both hands firmly on the table. And after all that, you want to call it constructive? The audience fell silent. Joy attempted to regain control, but Stallone was no longer willing to follow her lead. You asked me to defend my career, he said. So I'm going to defend it. He reminded her that he had spent decades dealing with rejection long before the world knew his name. He had been told that his voice was wrong, his appearance was wrong, and that he would never become the kind of leading man Hollywood wanted. And every time somebody told me I couldn't do it, Stallone continued, I kept working. Joy tried to interject again. Stallone stopped her. No, you had your turn. His voice was now unmistakably forceful. You wanted to know what keeps me going? That's it. I don't quit because somebody decides I've had enough. For the first time, Joy appeared to realize that the interview was no longer under her control. Stallone's voice remained intense, but something deeper had taken over the conversation. He was no longer reacting to Joy's accusations. He was explaining the part of his life she had completely overlooked. You don't know what it took to get here, he said. He reminded her that success had not erased the years when nobody wanted him. Before Rocky became a cultural phenomenon, he had spent years being rejected and struggling to find even small opportunities. The difference was that he refused to accept rejection as the final answer. People look at the success, Stallone continued, but they don't look at everything that happened before it. He talked about the doors that had been closed, the people who told him he wasn't right for Hollywood, and the pressure to abandon the character that eventually changed his life. And now you're sitting here telling me that because I succeeded, I should feel guilty for still being here? Joy remained quiet. The power at the table had shifted completely. Stallone was no longer asking permission to continue his career. He was challenging the assumption that success automatically created an obligation to disappear. You think I forgot where I came from? He asked. Then he leaned forward. I remember it every single day. And that was when the conversation moved toward the one subject Joy thought she could use against him: representation. Stallone looked directly at Joy as the subject of representation came back into the conversation. You want to talk about representation? He asked. Then let's talk about it honestly. He explained that Rocky was never created as a symbol of privilege or easy success. Rocky was a struggling working-class man who had been overlooked, underestimated, and told that he wasn't important enough to matter. That character represented people who were told they weren't good enough, Stallone said. His voice carried less anger now and more conviction. When I wrote Rocky, I wasn't trying to create somebody perfect. I was trying to create somebody who refused to stay down. He reminded Joy that the studios hadn't initially wanted him in the role. They wanted a more established star. Stallone had fought to play the character because he believed audiences deserved to see someone who looked and sounded like an ordinary person become extraordinary through persistence. That's representation, he said. The table remained silent. You don't make room for new voices by pretending the people who came before them don't matter. Joy attempted to respond, but Stallone continued. There is room for everybody. There always has been. Then came the line that changed the emotional weight of the entire confrontation. I know what it feels like to be told you don't belong, he said. That's why I never wanted anyone working with me to feel that way. And suddenly, the argument wasn't about age anymore. It was about what a lifetime of struggle had taught him. Stallone slowly turned away from Joy and looked toward the camera. His voice was calmer now, but the intensity hadn't disappeared. I came here today to talk about my work, he said. I came here to talk about stories, characters, and the people who have supported me for decades. He paused. Instead, I've spent this entire interview defending whether I even deserve to keep doing what I love. The studio remained silent. Stallone explained that his success had never meant he stopped caring about people who were just beginning their careers. He pointed out that throughout his time in Hollywood, he had worked with younger actors, writers, directors, and filmmakers, often giving them opportunities when larger studios were unwilling to take the risk. I know what it's like to need somebody to open a door, he said. I've been standing outside those doors myself. Then he looked back toward Joy. So if you want to criticize my movies, criticize them. If you don't like a performance, say it. That's part of the business. His expression hardened. But don't tell me that I should be ashamed for still being here. That statement landed harder than the shouting ever could. Stallone had stopped arguing for approval. He was making it clear that he didn't need permission to continue. And then he made one final decision that nobody at the table expected. Stallone sat quietly for a moment, looking across the table at Joy. There was no shouting now. That almost made the moment more powerful. He reached toward the microphone attached to his jacket and slowly removed it. Joy watched him carefully. Sly, we're not finished, she said. Stallone shook his head. I think we are. The room went completely silent. He stood from his chair and adjusted his jacket, maintaining the same controlled composure he had carried into the studio that morning. I came here in good faith, he said. I was ready to talk about the work. I was ready to answer difficult questions. But there's a difference between a difficult question and an interview that becomes an attack. Joy attempted to respond, but Stallone continued. I'm not going to sit here and argue about whether I deserve to have a career. He looked toward the other hosts before turning back to Joy. I've spent my entire life earning that right. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Stallone placed the microphone on the table. I'm done here. He stepped away from the chair and began walking off the set. Joy remained frozen. The other hosts watched in silence. And just like that, an ordinary promotional interview had become something nobody in the studio could have predicted. For several seconds after Stallone walked away, nobody at the table seemed to know what to say. The silence was almost unnatural. Joy remained in her chair, staring toward the direction Stallone had disappeared. The confidence she had shown at the beginning of the interview was gone. Whatever she had expected when the conversation started, this clearly wasn't it. The other hosts exchanged uncomfortable looks. Nobody immediately tried to fill the silence. Even the audience seemed unsure whether to applaud, react, or simply remain quiet. Behind the cameras, the production staff were suddenly moving with urgency. The interview had been scheduled as a straightforward promotional segment, but the conversation had turned into something entirely different. Whoopi looked toward Joy, then toward the empty chair. This really got out of hand, she said quietly. Joy didn't answer immediately. She appeared to be processing what had just happened. Only minutes earlier, she had been controlling the direction of the interview. Now the guest had walked away, leaving the entire table frozen behind him. And the most uncomfortable part was still ahead. Because once the cameras stopped rolling, everyone would have to confront the question nobody wanted to ask. How did a routine interview turn into this? It didn't take long for the confrontation to escape the studio. What had happened between Stallone and Joy Behar quickly became the subject of intense discussion, with viewers debating whether the interview had crossed a line or whether Stallone had simply reacted too strongly under pressure. The most replayed moments were the ones where Stallone stopped defending individual movies and began defending his entire career. His comments about being underestimated decades earlier struck a particular nerve with viewers who had followed his journey from struggling actor to international star. Others focused on Joy's questions, arguing that challenging powerful celebrities is part of a host's job and that Stallone should have been prepared for criticism. But another group saw something completely different. They believed the confrontation wasn't really about criticism. It was about respect. As the discussion grew, people began dissecting the exchange line by line. Why did Stallone remain calm for so long? What finally pushed him over the edge? And did Joy realize how far the conversation had gone before it was too late? The debate only made the story bigger. Because once millions of people started choosing sides, the interview was no longer just an uncomfortable television moment. It had become a full-blown public argument about age, success, Hollywood, and the price of refusing to step aside. And the most important question was still unanswered. Who actually won that confrontation? The reason this confrontation continued to resonate wasn't simply because two strong personalities disagreed. It was because the argument touched something much deeper. Stallone wasn't only defending a movie or a franchise. He was defending the years of rejection, sacrifice, and persistence that came before the success everyone now takes for granted. Joy's questions forced a larger issue into the open. When does experience become an advantage, and when does it become a reason to step aside? Stallone's answer was clear. He didn't believe longevity should automatically disqualify someone from creating. And perhaps that was the part that connected most strongly with viewers. Because millions of people understand what it feels like to be told they're too old, too late, too inexperienced, or simply no longer relevant. Stallone's reaction came from a lifetime of refusing to accept those judgments. But the confrontation also raised another question. Could Joy have made the same points without turning the conversation personal? That is what made the exchange so difficult to dismiss. The disagreement wasn't really about one interview. It was about dignity, ambition, criticism, and whether success should ever require someone to apologize for continuing to pursue what they love. And in the end, Stallone's most powerful moment wasn't when his voice became louder. It was when he decided he didn't need to keep arguing at all. In the end, the most powerful part of the confrontation may not have been Stallone's anger at all. It was the moment he realized he didn't have to prove his worth to anyone sitting across that table. For decades, he had been told he wasn't good enough, wasn't the right choice, wasn't built for Hollywood, and eventually, that his time had passed. Yet he kept showing up. And that is exactly why this confrontation struck such a nerve. Joy may have believed she was simply asking difficult questions. Stallone clearly believed something much more personal was happening. And somewhere between those two perspectives, a routine interview turned into a moment neither side could easily take back. So what do you think? Did Joy Behar cross the line with her questions? Or was Stallone too defensive about criticism of his career? Was his decision to walk away the right move? Or should he have stayed and finished the conversation? Let me know your opinion in the comments. And if this story kept you watching until the very end, make sure to subscribe, because there are plenty more unforgettable celebrity confrontations and unexpected moments still to come. Sometimes the person who looks calmest in the room is the one who has been holding back the longest.